Lindsay Marshall. I'm on the marketing team here at Miro, and today's session is all about distributed team tips with the MailChimp team. So Holly, Kalita, and Jess, please take it away.
So hi, I'm Jess Harbor. I'm in the Atlanta Ponce City Market office for MailChimp. I'm a senior project here on one of our largest teams with more stakeholders than most other teams experience. So what I'm going to be talking to y'all today is how to encourage process alignment and understanding across larger organizations. I'm not nervous, you're nervous. Okay, so let's get started. Just to give you guys a little bit of an insight into what our team responds to, this is kind of a view of our corner of the world. This isn't all of MailChimp by any stretch of the imagination, but if you look at this revenue domain box down here, that's the team that I work on. And these are all the people that we roll up to. And so one of the things about working on a distributed team is, yes, that does mean that we're working with people all over the country and internationally, but it also means that we're working with all departments at the company. We're working with different product teams, et cetera. So keeping alignment with those people is really, really important. And that can feel distributed as well, right? Because you have different goals, you have different communication styles, you have different processes, et cetera. So this is just a snapshot of my corner of the world. Holly and Kalita's corner of the world looks a lot different than mine. So you're getting a lot of different perspectives today. All right, so I'm just gonna talk a little bit about information asymmetry, which is what I see as the largest problem statement project management faces. And it's something that we've really been able to utilize Miro to help us out with. So information asymmetry is basically any situation where one party has more or better information, has access to that information than the other party. And so this happens upstream and downstream from a team. Sometimes, the team we're in the part of the project lifecycle where your team has the majority of the information and your stakeholders are kind of suffering, right? They're not in the day-to-day, they're not in the weeds with you, they don't really know what's going on. And that can cause a lot of frustration, right? But then in other parts of the project lifecycle, the opposite is true, right? Where the team is like, we don't have all the requirements we need, we're not sure what decisions are being made, we're not in those conversations. And so in those moments, it's really frustrating for the implementation team, right? So how do you know you're kind of dealing with this? There are some symptoms that are kind of telltale. Symptoms include, like I mentioned, frustration, feeling like you can't keep up. It feels like your requirements of the scope of your project are changing out of nowhere. You're finding yourself with just way too many cooks in the kitchen, right? There are too many people that have opinions or are trying to impact the situation and you're just trying to get your job done. And this kind of happens when people aren't feeling confident, right? People at all levels are just not feeling confident in what's going on. Your core team doesn't feel bought in, right? They don't feel like they really understand what's going on. They don't feel like they agree with it. They're not sure. Having a vague or misunderstood timeline. So sometimes, stakeholder will be like, we're going to get this in a month, right? And you're like, where did you get that, friend? And those kinds of things. And then unclear prioritization, like how does this work impact the work that we're already doing, et cetera. So how does this happen? Sometimes this happens because we don't understand our roles and responsibilities between stakeholders and the team. We're having siloed conversations, we're creating small kingdoms because we're all trying to react to the situation in order to get this thing done, right? We're miscommunicating or we're not meeting each other's expectations because we don't know what each other's expectations are, right? Because we're not talking about it. We also, have a misunderstanding of different processes and procedures between departments, right? The way that the product department operates and the way the design department operates are very different, and that's okay. That's by nature. The types of work and the types of things they think about are different, and that's okay. We just need to remember that we need to have empathy for those things and an understanding of how each other work. And then oftentimes there's no source of truth, right? Everything's word of mouth. Everything is just all over the place. And so everybody's looking for information and they're finding it in different places. And this is going to lead to more of that misalignment. But this happens, this is natural. People are people, and this is all human nature. So Don't beat yourself up about it. It's going to happen. It's going to happen time and time again. We just need to do something about it, right? We have to have a clear path forward. All right, so we'll talk about a little bit about providing that context. So having what behaviors can we support our tooling with, right? Because as human beings, our behaviors are what's going to drive change, and tools like Miro help us really push through that impact. All right, so start with your core team. Start with the people that you work with and see every day, the people who are going to be implementing this work, and intentionally establish team norms and your software development lifecycle, and then write it down and hold each other to it. So this is just a brainstorm that one of the squads or one of the teams on my domain had recently, establishing their norms, right? So Miro has this really great feature where you can set a timer and everybody just brainstorms and gets their thoughts out on the board, and then that way we can vote on those, we can talk about them, etc. And this helps your team frame how they're going to work together moving forward so that we're aligned. We're starting with that core team and making sure that we understand how we want to work, right? All right, then talk up to your core team's leadership. Talk to your product manager, your account manager, your design manager, your project manager, etc. Figure out how we all play into this. What is our team needing from us at the core team level? And what do our stakeholders need from us? What is our relationship with our stakeholders? What types of information do we own? And what are we driving toward as a team? Write it down, establish it, remind each other of it, and trust each other to do those jobs, right? And here we used Miro very similarly to how we did it at the team norm level. All right, we're back to that view of kind of stakeholders, right? Understanding your dependent teams as stakeholders and intentionally building empathy for their workflows and goals is really important. And a great way to do this is to map out who these people are, understand what their department goals are, what are their department core values, what are they really trying to do this year, this quarter, etc. And then you know what kind of information to share up to them, right? To share out to them what kind of information you can expect coming in from them and how you can better manage that conversation between your core team and your stakeholders. All right, so using a tool to close this gap, right? So building that empathy between your stakeholders and your team in both directions is really important. So something that you can do is diagram your workflow. Sit down with your team and talk through how you actually work, not ideal state. This isn't a norms conversation, right? This is right now, how do we work? What artifacts do we put out? What communication needs to be happening in these phases? How do we build product, right? Identify these areas, color code it, do whatever you need to do, and then map that into a RACI chart, right? Have all of your core team leadership and your stakeholders mapped out, and just build yourself a RACI chart to make sure everybody agrees on where they're informed, where they're consulted, responsible, etc. And then map those two things together, right? Having something color-coded, having something that's easily referenceable and gets updated each time there's a change to your team, a change to a process, a change to a priority, etc. Making sure that it's updated alongside that goes a long way. Reminding everybody that this exists, hey, don't forget that there's that Miro board that tells you, as a stakeholder, right now, we're informing you. We understand you're excited and you want to help us get moving along. But right now we're in phase 1 of our processes. So hang tight. You can expect artifacts and meetings on your calendar in phase 2, which is slated to begin in 2 sprints. All right, so all of this sounds great in theory, right? But how do you make sure in practice this is adopted and adhered to? So some pro tips is to take time to properly roll this out, right? Something that we do pretty often is we'll say, okay, here's a document, read it, and now everybody's just going to start doing it. That's not how the human mind works, right? We kind of need that moment where we're kicking something off and we're starting something new. So have a kickoff meeting or have a lunch and learn, make it fun. Get buy-in. Get feedback from your team. Don't just prescribe something, right? Make sure that they're on board with it. Get their suggestions. I think, especially in leadership roles, we're always feeling really responsible to just say a thing, dictate a thing, say this is the way it needs to be done. But sometimes the people who are actually, or most of the time really, the people who are actually doing the work and are impacted by these processes and procedures have way better ideas than we do, right? Be flexible. Requirements, situations, and people change, and that's okay. Adaptation is important, and we need to remind ourselves of that. Communicate really broadly and concisely. The shorter you can make a message and the more concise you can make a message and action items, the better. And create sort of a regular cadence for these things. Build trust. So what I mean by this is be kind of the vulnerable party. Trust people around you to do what they tell you they're going to do. And you'll find that you develop a mutual unconditional fondness with your team and your stakeholders where you're relying on each other and you're trusting each other. Ooh, that's Kalita. All right, well, I'm doing great. All right, anti-patterns. So what we don't want to do is weaponize workflows and RACI charts to put walls up around our team. It can feel like the right thing to do to protect your team from stakeholders or people who have interest in what's going on and aren't on the team, but really transparency is key. And while we do want to hold ourselves accountable to our processes and not have, stakeholders coming to your designer and trying to make requirements changes, we also don't want them to feel like there's this huge wall up. And if an engineer has a question that only legal can answer, they can't just go ask legal directly, right? You don't want to have walls put up, so you don't want to weaponize this and use it as a mechanism to protect. You don't want to have infrequent or too little communication, but you also don't want to have over detailed communication. No one reads that stuff. I complain constantly that nobody ever reads my Slack messages, and it's honestly my own fault. Sometimes I send them too frequently and they're too long, right? Expecting the tool or documentation to do the work for you. So in Agile, we say interactions over tools and processes, right? So expecting a tool or a documentation to do the work for you isn't going to work. You have to have the same conversations. You have to go out of your way to have those in-person conversations, whether it's over Zoom or it's face-to-face, whatever it is. Make sure that you're still talking to people and not just sending a link to a document to fill gaps, right? All right, and letting tools become static instead of keeping them dynamic. Don't get stuck in your ways. Be, like I said before, be flexible. And revisit what's working and not working on a regular basis. Make sure that you're asking, does this feel okay? And your team will tell you sometimes without even telling you that you can feel the discomfort rise. And again, that's normal. Embrace it and roll with the punches. That's all I've got, and I will pass off to Kalita.
All right. So my name is Kalita Allen. I'm a UX researcher in the Ponce City Market, Atlanta office at MailChimp. And this is actually really exciting for me. I'm going to be talking to you about how you can use cross-functional collaboration to go from research insights to an actual user-focused backlog that your product team can action on. So, in April of last year, a fellow UX researcher and I ran a 3-hour workshop with our product team. This group consisted of a designer, marketer, product manager, customer support agent, and 7 engineers. So as a UX researcher, my colleague and I had the goal of grounding our product team in user insights. And we had to determine what that primary problem that needed to be solved was. This was a pretty rare occasion for us as a team because our team was pretty well distributed. So as you can see, we had about a 60-40 split between the Atlanta and Oakland, California offices. We also had 1 developer in Boulder, Colorado. So our team represented 3 different time zones across the entire United States. Once we left our on-site, we were challenged with aligning and actioning on the research insights from our off-site and a targeted problem statement. And this could really prove to be challenging. But thankfully, we had 2 things at our disposal. We had Miro and the power of user story mapping. So, in this first step, we'll discuss what research is important to share, what methods to apply it to, and how to set it up in Miro. So, Because this workshop typically takes about 3 to 4 hours, I recommend taking about 5 to 6 hours or so preparing for it. And the first step in that preparation process is really understanding the method. To move our team from research to action, we decided to use the user story mapping technique, which is a collaborative solutioning technique that was coined by Jeff Patton. This helps teams move from sharing requirements to developing a shared understanding. So instead of being output-driven and releasing pieces of an entire product at a time, which is what you can see here at the top, teams are instead inspired to become outcome-driven, to focus on releasing complete products that drive faster user satisfaction with less cost and time. So you can see here an example of Patton's user story map. At the top, from left to right, are user activities, and then at the bottom are stories within those activities, ranked in order of priority to the user. Finally, you can see slices of those end-to-end stories, which helps to represent phases of release. So you can have your MVP slice, then release 2, release 3, etc. So Casey will actually be sharing out Patton's PDF, which is really, really helpful if you want a quick overview of the Jeff Patton user story mapping technique. So after you understand the method, you need to move on to choosing and preparing the participants. Patton discusses setting the participant size to the size of a dinner party, which is about 6 to 8 people. Because this is a distributed workshop, you have to be even more aware of your participant size so you can continuously keep folks engaged and not simultaneously checking email or Slack or etc. I recommend starting with about 6 participants per facilitator. Your group should consist of the folks needed to build the product. So remember those engineers and designers I referred to on the on-site? Well, those are the very folks that you need to involve in the session. Your engineer, especially the lead or staff, as well as your product manager, are going to be super beneficial to your success because they're the folks that are going to be needed to slice and translate your stories to cards in Jira. Because our participants were across time zones, choosing the right time to actually have your workshop, such as 1 p.m. Eastern time, is incredibly important. Share this in advance, along with the research needed as links in the calendar invite and on Slack or email. Wherever your team engages is key. So now for the research. I recommend sharing a quick digestible user summary so your participants can easily think from your target user's eyes. The empathy map was incredibly useful here, along with the user persona and the problem that you're trying to solve. Also include the 3 or so goals that your team is trying to accomplish. Now it's time to set up your Miro board. Thankfully, this should be pretty easy. Miro's done a wonderful job highlighting specific collaborative methods for researchers and designers. They have several articles, in-app tutorials, and templates to help you quickly set up your user story map, which Casey will also be able to send out. The 2 story map templates that Miro have include the far right one that I've highlighted here, which is the original sticky note version, and the one in the center that's highlighted, the new interactive one that works along with keyboard shortcuts. It's pretty cool. So there also are specific features in Miro that make setting this up a breeze. If you use the newer user interactive user story map, you can install the tool from your Miro apps and add it to your toolbar so you can quickly add additional activities to your map. You can use the tagging feature as well to color code participants' names to the stickies so you can always know who wrote what, and you can refer back to it later on. And the shortcuts, as I mentioned before, are incredibly helpful from an accessibility and efficiency perspective, so you can add additional activities and tasks, as well as edit them. You can find this in the bottom right-hand corner of your Miro board if you use the new interactive story map. Now I'm going to show you an example of what this board looks like in Miro. So even though Miro provides like this infinity canvas, you should try keeping your working space as simple as possible, which with each frame labeled, so your participants can always find their place. To your left, you'll see the toolbar with the added user story map tool. Then there's the time breakdown, and then underneath that, the goals and anti-goals. Then you need to include your research that's needed, including the user goals, their problem, and a brief description of the method. And then finally, an example of the user story map technique. Make sure that your user story map is surrounded by all of the activity frames that you'll need to actually utilize during the session. And finally, you want to make sure your participants know to uncheck collaborator cursors in the setting area that you see there to the right. You can have, if you have quite a few folks in your session, it can get a bit confusing seeing all of the arrows moving around. Again, simplicity is key. Now we'll move on to actually using the user story map in Miro. So warm-ups are everything. They serve as both an icebreaker and example of what to expect in the actual workshop. But warm-ups have an added bonus for distributed teams, allowing folks who are less comfortable with Miro actually get used to the tool. And also as a facilitator, this allows you to warm up before you actually get into the meat of the exercise. Be sure participants have their mic muted if they aren't talking. Get comfortable calling out names of folks who you know should speak next, or even better, get your participants used to the round robin that you would typically do in an in-person workshop. But instead, if you do stickies, you can do it from left to right so they know who's going to go next. And also make sure that you keep track of time. Your warm-up shouldn't take very long. So if you need to, lean on the Miro's timer that Jess mentioned before for an added bonus. As you map your activities, provide prompts on the same frame you're working on, so everything your participants engage with is directly in front of them, so they don't have to search throughout the endless board for directions. Be sure to share your screen so everyone can follow along together, and it actually feels like a collaborative workshop. Again, share from left to right and then cluster, and before you move on, make sure to air out any concerns or thoughts. You might have to call on the quieter folks, as you would typically in an in-person workshop. Now you'll want to go deep into each activity to generate all of the tasks that exist. Prompt your folks with questions about what other types of users you haven't considered, what other things could go wrong, and what are the other things that they could do. Again, team agreement is key. And just continue to monitor facial expressions throughout the workshop. Now it's time to add all of your activities and tasks into your map and prioritize them. Miro has made prioritizing super easy. If you're using the sticky note template, prioritize stickies by upvoting with emojis. I'd use this one instead of Miro's voting tool, so you can have a living artifact of votes. If you use the new interactive template, just drag and drop using the up and down keyboard shortcuts to rearrange tasks. And this is an example of what a relatively small yet completed story map looks like in Miro. Now, let's use the Miro to Jira integration to make the research actionable. The Miro to Jira integration was a place our team struggled with last year, but Miro has made some improvements since. You won't have time to fill in the cards with all of the user stories, assignees, deadlines, so lean on engineering and your product manager to complete this. Once it's filled in Miro, you can add the integration and you can connect to your Jira page. And here's an example of one of our tasks in Jira. But before it's actually in Jira, be sure to keep your story map as a solid artifact so you can share it with internal and external stakeholders. This is how we took our research and made it actionable for product teams using the power of Miro.
All right, hey everyone. My name is Holly Tawari. I'm a staff service designer at MailChimp based in our Brooklyn office. And today I'm going to talk about how to apply remote first principles to lead design brainstorms that are inclusive, efficient, and actionable, even more so than in-person sessions. So you all may have had experience with a traditional design brainstorm meeting that looked something like this, where the team is all in one room, sketching ideas on paper, sticky notes, and then forming small groups to share, and then just coming together as a full team to discuss. So I love these type of meetings, and over time became really comfortable facilitating these exercises. But when MailChimp shifted to becoming distributed across multiple locations, this format just wasn't possible anymore. So I was actually the first designer outside of our Atlanta headquarters. So I spent a lot of time experimenting with ways to make collaborative design activities like brainstorming work in a remote environment. When I discovered Miro as a collaboration tool, that was a game changer. So today I'm really going to talk about how I use Miro to run distributed brainstorms that end up being more efficient than in-person sessions. First up, we're going to start with all the work I do to prep for the session. A lot of what Kalita talked about was around how doing more work up front really makes the session go smoother and participants have to do less. So my first tip is pairing with a partner. It's super helpful to have that co-facilitator who knows your goals for the session to help you keep on track and do supporting efforts, things like Time Cup, running that timer for you, helping start conversation in small groups, help you doing affinity mapping and moving those sticky notes around, and really just taking notes on your facilitation skills so that you can continue to improve with every session that you run. Next up, you want to be sure to set expectations in the calendar invite for all your team members who are coming to the brainstorm. You don't need to go too deep into the specific prompt, but definitely clarify why that person specifically is invited, the general topic you're going to be focusing on, and any required materials that they should have at their desk with them. You also want to emphasize that this is fully remote session you'll be doing in Miro and Zoom. And then the day of the meeting, I usually tend to drop a note in our Slack channel to remind people, again, to like gather all those materials. Next up, and Kalita talked about this already, is you want to spend some time prepping the Miro board. So here's an example that we'll jump into in a bit more detail in a minute. But this is what my standard Miro template looks like. So we have over here some background information, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. You want to assign each participant their own kind of frame here in Miro for posting their own individual ideas. And I tend to repeat the prompt on everyone's screen so they have an easy place to reference it. And then you have this big frame in the center for affinity mapping ideas. A common brainstorming framework is the think, pair, share method. So during Think, you give participants time to brainstorm ideas individually. In pair, people can discuss ideas with a partner or a small group to narrow down to their top favorites. And then share, people come back together as a whole group to share their favorite 1 or 2 ideas. To do this, Zoom actually has a really great feature called breakout rooms that automatically pulls people into small groups. So what I like to do in prep is go ahead and you can see I've assigned every person a group. So I have their name and then group A, B, or C. So thinking about these groups avoids the scramble of like, okay, everybody find a partner like in the middle of the meeting, if I just go ahead and pre-assign that. All right, it's time to actually run your brainstorming session. So here are some tips for making sure it goes smoothly. First up, you want to start with all the logistics and agenda. So I'm actually going to switch tabs here and jump into one of my real Miro boards. So like I said, here's kind of the standard template I use for all my brainstorms. I duplicate this every time I'm going to do another one and then just edit the details. So let me zoom in over here. I like to put this giant yellow star that says start here. So it kind of orients people when they drop into the board. So we'll start off by reviewing kind of the logistics. Again, making sure everyone has the supplies they need. We often still sketch on actual sticky notes. So I make sure people have those at their desk. Reminder to close out distractions, that kind of stuff. Then I actually go through the sticky note recognition instructions, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next, I go through the agenda, so making sure everybody knows what to expect during our time together. And then I have a little frame here about the problem background. So I walk through this so that everyone has the same understanding of the research. A lot of like what Kalita was mentioned, you want to get everyone on the team up to speed on what problems you're solving from the user's perspective as you brainstorm solutions. All right. Next up, this is kind of embarrassing, but you want to remember who's actually in the room. Especially if you're doing a distributed session and you're sharing your screen in Zoom, you can really only see about 5 people at a time, and there's probably going to be more than 5 people in your brainstorm. Like here, I had 10 people on the call. So first off, you want to make sure everyone turns their video on, and if not everyone is on the same team or works together frequently, make sure you do a round of intros. Just because you're not sitting in a room together, make sure everyone knows who everyone else is, because you're going to be talking. And then when you're facilitating and sharing your screen, like I mentioned, it's hard to kind of remember who else is here. So my lo-fi solution is actually keeping a sticky note at my desk next to me and writing everyone's name down. So I know kind of how many avatars I'm looking for in the sidebar. So what I'll usually do is I'll make a check mark once I see people join the meeting, and then I'll do a second check mark if we do something like breakout rooms, and then people have to rejoin a second time. So it's lo-fi, but it works for me. Next up, both Kalita and Jess mentioned the awesome Miro timer. I use this all the time. So it's great. It's this little icon down here on the bottom. When you turn it on, you can set the time, and then it shows up on everyone's Miro screen at the same time. So this is really great for heads down sketching portion, so everyone kind of knows how much time is remaining for that session. Next up, upbeat instrumental music really helps avoid that awkward silence when everyone is doing that silent brainstorming or sketching, or when people are doing tasks like importing their sticky notes into Miro. So Zoom has a great feature. You just click share your computer sound, and then you can play music through Spotify or whatever, and all the other participants can hear it. In the resources that Casey will share after, I'll share a link to my favorite design ideation playlist. Next up, this is probably my favorite Miro feature ever. They have this thing called sticky recognition, although I think they just changed the name to something like sticky note capture. But this is really great. So I find that sketching is still easier to do physically versus like digitally in the computer. So I'll have people bring physical sticky notes and sketch with a Sharpie. And then to quickly get them into Miro, you can use this sticky recognition feature. So I actually have these step-by-step instructions that I have in my Miro board for people to reference. So here's a quick overview of how it works. So participants can lay out all their sticky notes on their desk and take a picture. They don't have to do it one at a time. They can include all their stickies at once. Then you kind of just send the photo to yourself, or you can use either AirDrop or just Slack it to yourself. So you want to make sure you get that image onto your computer. Then you go into Miro, and in the sidebar, you click the 3-dot icon and select the sticky recognition tool, navigate to that image, and then Miro will kind of identify like where your sticky notes are. You'll see with these outlines. Sometimes if you're kind of drawing boxes, it'll like pick up an extra box that it thinks is a sticky note, but you could just click on that to deselect it, and then it won't be confused anymore. And then you just click add to board, and then all these sticky notes appear in your Miro board as individual objects you can move around as needed. It's super quick. I usually allow about 5 to 10 minutes for people to go through this process on their own, but it works super well. Next up, there's a voting add-on in Miro that works just like traditional dot voting, but it has the added bonus that all the votes are anonymous and hidden until the end, so no one's biased by seeing where other people are voting. It's pretty straightforward. You set the time limit, the amount of votes per person, and then you're off and running. When the time is up, you'll see something like this on the right, where Miro will show you the results ranked by which sticky notes or other options got the highest votes. Last up, after celebrating that you actually did the brainstorming session, here are a few tips for how to make sure things continue to go well after the session. First up, you want to sync up with your partner, your co-facilitator, and talk about what went well and opportunities to improve. It's really important to do this right after the session because you will forget everything, or at least I do. Logistics notes specifically are important to capture while that's fresh in your mind. Things like, oh, I forgot to hide cursors or other things like that. You can make sure to take a note of so you do better next time. Next, you want to identify common ideas or themes that came out of your session and kind of decide which to move forward with. This is super easy to do if you use the voting, but if not, again, just sync up with your partner and kind of align on how to move forward. And then you get to go forth and conquer with all these great new ideas you have. And hopefully you ended your session with all the participants by clarifying next steps. But I find that it's also a good idea to restate this in a more public forum, maybe Slack or email, to thank everyone for their time and kind of, again, recap on the next steps, but really provide that visibility for the broader team or stakeholders or maybe folks who weren't able to attend. That's all I've got.
I want to thank Holly, Kalita, Jess, for taking the time to share distributed team tips with us. With that, I'm gonna let everyone enjoy their evening, morning, afternoon, whatever time it is. And thank you so, so much. We'll see you next time.